The dim light of a single candle flickers against the blood-stained walls of an underground bunker near Cherbourg. 9 German nurses, their uniforms stiff with dried antiseptic, emerge trembling into the blinding daylight, expecting scorn, humiliation, perhaps death. Instead, they are escorted past crates overflowing with pristine bandages, gleaming surgical instruments, and vials of penicillin they had believed were a myth. In that moment, their world, built on propaganda and scarcity, begins to unravel. If you're drawn to forgotten corners of WWII history and the human stories buried beneath the headlines, stay with us. Subscribe to uncover more truths the war tried to hide. July 2nd, 1944. The fortress city of Cherbourg has fallen after weeks of brutal siege warfare. Deep beneath the concrete and steel of German fortifications, makeshift hospitals carved from bunkers echo with the groans of wounded soldiers and the whispered prayers of exhausted medical staff. Oberschwester Maria Hoffmann adjusts her Red Cross armband for what she believes will be the last time. Around her, 8 fellow nurses gather their meagre supplies, a handful of morphine vials, surgical instruments dulled from overuse, and bandages boiled so many times they've lost their sterility. The candles that have lit their underground surgeries flicker in the damp air, casting dancing shadows on walls stained with the evidence of desperate medical procedures. When the American voices echo down the bunker corridors, the nurses expect the worst. Nazi propaganda has painted their enemies as barbarous, particularly toward medical personnel who have treated German soldiers. They emerge with hands raised, squinting against sunlight they haven't seen in days, their white uniforms now grey with dirt and dried blood. What happens next shatters every assumption they've carried into captivity. Colonel James Mitchell of the 8th Field Hospital doesn't order them to their knees or strip them of their medical insignia. Instead, he escorts them through what appears to be a medical wonderland. Surgical tents hum with electric generators. Refrigeration units maintain perfect temperatures for blood plasma storage. Tables overflow with supplies they recognize from textbooks but have never seen in such abundance. Sulfur powder measured not in precious grams but scattered liberally across wounds, bandages so white and clean they seem to glow. Nurse Hoffmann stares at an American medic casually discarding a barely used bandage, reaching for a fresh one from an seemingly endless supply crate. In her underground hospital, that same bandage would have been carefully cleaned, dried, and reused until it disintegrated. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. This abundance contradicts everything she's been taught about American industrial weakness and the righteousness of Germany's resource-driven war. As they're processed according to Geneva Convention protocols, the German nurses witness something that will haunt their understanding of warfare itself. American medical personnel treating German wounded with the same care, the same precious medications, the same surgical precision reserved for their own soldiers. But this first glimpse of abundance was only the beginning. Far greater shocks awaited them on the long journey inland. To understand the psychological earthquake that struck those 9 nurses in Normandy, we must journey backward through time and across continents to the scorching sands of North Africa, where the first cracks in German medical certainty had already begun to form. May 13, 1943. The Afrika Korps, once Rommel's pride, surrenders in Tunisia. Among the 250,000 prisoners are dozens of German nurses who have served through 2 years of desert warfare, rationing every aspirin, boiling bandages in contaminated water, and performing surgery by flickering lamplight. Schwester Ilse Schultz, holder of the Iron Cross Second Class, one of fewer than 20 women to receive this honor, keeps a careful diary during her first weeks in American custody. Her entries, discovered decades later in German military archives, reveal the beginning of an ideological transformation that would reshape her understanding of everything she'd been taught to believe. Day 3 in American custody, she writes. They have given us more medical supplies for processing prisoners than our entire hospital received in the final month of fighting. I watched an American orderly throw away gauze that appeared barely used. When I asked why, he looked confused and said there were thousands more boxes. Thousands. We fought over individual roles. The Liberty ships that transport German medical personnel to America become floating contradictions to Nazi propaganda. These mass-produced vessels, assembled in American shipyards at an impossible pace, contain medical facilities that surpass anything the nurses knew in their homeland. Operating theatres with consistent electrical power, X-ray machines that function reliably, and most shocking of all, properly typed and stored blood plasma that eliminates the dangerous direct transfusions German forces had been forced to attempt. Schwester Greta Falk, a Nathette, an Iron Cross recipient, documents her bewilderment at American waste. They discard food that would feed a German family for days. Their medics eat from tin cans containing more meat than we saw in weeks. Yet they share these rations freely with us, their enemies. I cannot reconcile this abundance with our teachings about American weakness and moral decay. During the Atlantic crossing, German nurses witnessed daily demonstrations of American industrial might. Medications they've only heard rumors about are dispensed routinely. Penicillin, that almost mythical wonder drug, appears in quantities that seem impossible. Most disturbing of all is the casual efficiency with which Americans organize this abundance, as if limitless resources are simply the natural order of things. By the time the ships dock at Norfolk and New York, seeds of doubt have been planted in minds conditioned by years of scarcity and sacrifice. These women, trained to see medical abundance as impossible without conquest and domination, begin to glimpse a different reality, one where prosperity comes not from stealing resources from others, but from creating them through industrial innovation and scientific advancement. The train rides across America would rip those seeds wide open, forcing the nurses to confront impossible truths. The locomotive whistle pierces the Virginia countryside as German prisoners begin their journey into the American heartland. For nurses who have spent years in field hospitals and bombed cities, what unfolds outside their train car windows defies comprehension. Richmond appears first, its skyline dominated not by factory smokestacks or military installations, but by the gleaming towers of the Medical College of Virginia. Schwester Hoffmann presses her face to the window, counting floors of what appears to be a medical complex larger than entire German hospitals. The building blazes with electric lights even in daylight, a casual display of energy abundance that speaks to resources beyond her imagination. In Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania hospital complex stretches across city blocks. These are not field hospitals or emergency installations, but permanent monuments to medical care built in peacetime and maintained during war. The sheer scale challenges everything the nurses understand about national priorities during total warfare. At a stop in Washington, D.C., American Red Cross volunteers board the train carrying packages for German prisoners. The contents, soap, chocolate, cigarettes, writing materials, represent luxuries that have vanished from German civilian life. But more disturbing than the material goods is the attitude of the volunteers. These Americans, many with sons fighting overseas, show no hatred toward enemy prisoners. They offer gifts with genuine kindness, even apologizing for the modest contents as if ashamed they cannot provide more. Nurse Schultz documents her confusion. A woman whose son died at Anzio gave me a hand-knitted scarf. She said no mother should see her child cold, even in war. I have been taught that Americans are driven by racial hatred, yet they show more Christian charity than I have witnessed in years of Nazi rally. Say, how can our enemies demonstrate virtues we claim to represent? The train passes through Baltimore, where Johns Hopkins Hospital rises like a medical cathedral. In Pittsburgh, Presbyterian Hospital's research towers gleam against the industrial skyline. City after city reveals the same pattern: medical facilities that dwarf anything in Germany, maintained and expanded even during total war. These institutions represent a fundamental difference in national character. While Germany strips resources from medical care to fuel military conquest, America builds hospitals even as it fights global war. At night stops, the nurses observe another impossibility. Fully illuminated cities. Street lights burn without restriction, hospital windows blaze with constant light, and even residential neighborhoods glow with electric abundance. This casual consumption of energy represents the ultimate contradiction to Nazi teachings about American weakness and resource limitations. In Chicago, the train pauses near Cook County Hospital, and German nurses witness something that shakes them to their core: African-American medical students entering the building alongside white colleagues. Nazi racial doctrine has taught them that America's racial mixing would create medical incompetence and social collapse. Instead, they observe a functioning system that contradicts every assumption about racial hierarchy and medical capability. As the landscape rolls past, endless farms producing abundance, factories working at full capacity, cities unmarked by bombing, the nurses begin to understand a terrible truth. Germany has been fighting an enemy whose resources make their own nation's capabilities seem almost primitive by comparison. Yet nothing prepared them for the laboratories and wards where their own skills would be tested side by side with their captors. Camp Opelika, Alabama, September 1943. The compound's hospital wing becomes a laboratory for the impossible, German and American medical personnel working side by side under Geneva Convention protocols that transform enemies into colleagues. The integration begins gradually. German nurses, still suspicious and ideologically rigid, are assigned to American supervisors who treat them not as conquered enemies, but as fellow medical professionals. Captain Dorothy Chen, herself a decorated army nurse, assigns Schwester Hoffmann to assist in surgical procedures using equipment that exists only in German medical dreams. The autoclave sterilizes instruments in minutes rather than the hours required by German field equipment. Electric cauterization replaces the crude burning techniques German surgeons have perfected through necessity. Most revolutionary of all are the adjustable surgical lights, brilliant, shadowless illumination that transforms precision surgery from impossibility to routine procedure. But technology is only part of the shock. American nursing practice contradicts every assumption about military medical hierarchy. Captain Chen encourages questions, solicits suggestions, and treats German input as professionally valuable rather than insubordinate interference. This collaborative approach, impossible under Nazi medical doctrine, produces results that speak for themselves: faster recoveries, fewer complications, and patient outcomes that German field hospitals could never achieve. The most profound challenges to Nazi ideology come from unexpected sources. Lieutenant Sarah Washington, an African-American nurse assigned to the prisoner ward due to military segregation policies, demonstrates surgical assistance techniques that surpass anything the German nurses learned in their training. Her knowledge of wound management, infection control, and patient monitoring contradicts every racial assumption they've carried into captivity. Schwester Falk writes in her diary, "Lieutenant Washington corrected my suturing technique today. Her knowledge of anatomy exceeds that of German doctors I have known. She explained procedures with patience and respect, treating me as a colleague despite my status as enemy prisoner. Nazi doctrine claims such racial mixing creates incompetence, yet I observe the opposite. A system that utilizes talent regardless of background produces superior results." At Fort Robinson, Nebraska, German nurses work in a facility that processes both American casualties and German prisoners using identical protocols. The moral implications are staggering. Enemy wounded receive the same quality care, the same precious medications, the same surgical attention as American soldiers. This equality of treatment, impossible under Nazi medical doctrine that prioritizes racial value over patient need, produces an ethical crisis that shakes the foundations of everything the nurses believe about medicine's purpose. The pharmacy at Camp Forest, Tennessee, becomes another revelation. Medications stored in climate-controlled conditions with expiration dates years in the future represent a supply chain that operates with industrial precision. German nurses, accustomed to rationing individual pills, watch American medics dispense antibiotics with casual abundance that borders on the incomprehensible. Working alongside American personnel reveals another disturbing truth. Their enemies are not the monsters Nazi propaganda portrayed. They are skilled professionals driven by the same desire to heal that motivated the German nurses to enter medicine. The realization that their enemies share their fundamental values while possessing vastly superior resources creates cognitive dissonance that grows stronger with each passing day. And then me, the moment that shattered not just their pride, but their entire medical worldview. Penicillin. The patient arrives at Glennon General Hospital with a compound fracture that would have meant certain amputation in any German field hospital. The bone protrudes through infected tissue, and the surrounding skin shows the telltale red streaks of advancing sepsis. In German hands, this soldier, American or German, it no longer seems to matter, would lose his leg within hours to save his life. Instead, Schwester Hoffmann watches American surgeons clean the wound, set the bone, and inject a clear solution she has heard whispered about in medical journals but never seen administered. Penicillin, the wonder drug that exists more as legend than reality in German medical understanding. What happens next defies everything she understands about infection and healing. Within 24 hours, the red streaks begin to fade. Within 48 hours, healthy tissue shows the first signs of regeneration. Within a week, the patient walks on crutches rather than learning to use a prosthetic limb. The numbers are staggering. American penicillin production in 1943 reaches 21 billion units. By 1945, that figure will explode to 6.8 trillion units. Industrial quantities that render infection a manageable condition rather than a death sentence. German nurses, trained to accept infection as an inevitable consequence of battlefield medicine, witness the systematic elimination of medical problems they considered unsolvable. At the 21st General Hospital in Mirecourt, France, German medical staff work with American colleagues processing casualties from the Western Front. The contrast in outcomes becomes impossible to ignore. German wounded, treated with American methods and medications, recover at rates that make their own medical training seem primitive by comparison. Penicillin transforms not just individual cases, but entire categories of medical possibility. Pneumonia, the great killer of wounded soldiers throughout military history, becomes a manageable condition. Wound infections that would have required amputation heal cleanly. Most profoundly, the casual abundance with which Americans dispense this miracle drug reveals the true scale of their industrial advantage. Schwester Schultz documents her realization. They use in one day what our entire nation could not produce in a year. This is not medicine. This is industrial warfare applied to healing. We have been fighting an enemy whose capacity to preserve life exceeds our capacity to take it. The moral implications are overwhelming. The German nurses begin to understand that American medical superiority represents more than technological advantage. It demonstrates a fundamental difference in national priorities and capabilities. While Germany stripped resources from medical research to fund weapons production, America simultaneously expanded both military and medical capacity through industrial innovation that renders their own nation's achievements almost insignificant by comparison. Working with penicillin becomes a daily reminder of their nation's limitations and their enemies' capabilities. Each successful treatment contradicts Nazi propaganda about American weakness while demonstrating the practical superiority of a system that values healing alongside warfare. But the greatest emotional shock would not come from a laboratory or a scalpel. It would come at Christmas. December 24, 1943. Snow falls gently on Camp Alva, Oklahoma, where German prisoners of war prepare for their first Christmas in American captivity. The nurses expect nothing. perhaps a slightly larger meal, certainly not the celebration that begins unfolding around them like a dream they dare not believe. The packages arrive by the thousands. American organizations have sent over 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners across the United States, each containing luxuries that have vanished from German civilian life. Coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes German families have learned to tolerate. Chocolate so rich and plentiful that prisoners share it freely rather than hoarding each precious piece. Cigarettes, soap, razor blades, warm clothing knitted by American women whose sons fight German soldiers across the Atlantic. Local churches in Alva organize carol singing outside the prison fence. Boy Scouts deliver handmade Christmas cards addressed simply to German prisoner, but decorated with religious symbols and messages of peace that transcend national boundaries. Methodist and Baptist congregations, led by families who have received telegrams about sons killed in action, choose to demonstrate Christian charity toward their enemies' representatives. The Christmas feast itself becomes a revelation of American abundance that borders on the surreal. Turkey, ham, fresh vegetables flown in from California, and desserts that represent luxury beyond anything German prisoners have experienced in years of war rationing. The casual abundance, second helpings encouraged, leftovers inevitable, demonstrates resource availability that makes German wartime sacrifice seem almost pointless by comparison. Schwester Hoffmann writes, Mrs. Patterson, whose son died at Salerno, brought homemade cookies to the camp fence. She spoke no German, I speak little English, but her tears mixed with mine as she pressed them through the wire. She said her boy would want enemy mothers' children fed during Christmas. I cannot reconcile this kindness with everything I have been taught about American racial hatred and moral corruption. The emotional impact extends beyond material generosity. American officials organize religious services that honor German Christmas traditions while demonstrating religious tolerance impossible under Nazi doctrine. Protestant and Catholic prisoners worship separately but equally, their spiritual needs respected despite their enemy status. This religious freedom, extended even to captured enemies, contradicts Nazi teachings about American religious persecution and moral decay. Perhaps most disturbing for Nazi-trained minds is the complete absence of racial superiority demonstrations. American guards treat German prisoners with professional courtesy rather than ideological hatred. Jewish American personnel interact normally with German prisoners, demonstrating none of the racial animosity Nazi propaganda predicted would dominate American military behavior. Christmas 1943 becomes a turning point for many German nurses. The systematic kindness, religious tolerance, and material abundance they experience contradicts fundamental assumptions about their enemy's character and capabilities. They begin to question not just German military prospects, but the entire ideological framework that brought them to war. The final blow to their indoctrination arrives with the liberation of the camps and the undeniable proof of the regime they served. April 1945. The projected images flicker on a makeshift screen at Camp Opelika as American officers present evidence that will shatter the final vestiges of Nazi loyalty among German medical personnel. The footage from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and other liberated concentration camps reveals horrors that render all previous assumptions about German moral superiority utterly meaningless. Schwester Hoffmann stares at skeletal figures that barely register as human beings. These are not combat casualties or unfortunate civilian victims of warfare. These are the systematic results of medical policies that perverted healing into murder. The nurses recognize medical facilities in the footage, hospitals that became death factories, and most damning of all, medical personnel who participated in systematic extermination rather than healing. Colonel Robert Harrison, chief medical officer at the camp, presents the evidence with clinical precision rather than emotional manipulation. You trained as healers, he tells the assembled German medical staff. These images show what happens when medicine serves ideology instead of humanity. We show you this not for revenge, but because you must understand what you're returning to rebuild. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. German medical experiments on prisoners, sterilization programs targeting racial undesirables, and euthanasia policies that murdered disabled patients contradict every principle the nurses learned in their medical training. Most horrifying is the realization that their profession, dedicated to preserving life, had been corrupted into an instrument of systematic murder. Schwester Schultz writes, "I became a nurse to save lives. I served a regime that trained nurses to end them. The Americans show us capabilities I never imagined, not just technological, but moral. They use medicine to heal enemies, while my nation used medicine to murder its own citizens. The shame is unbearable, but the truth cannot be denied." American medical officers emphasize that individual medical personnel are not responsible for systematic policies, but they must understand their profession's corruption under Nazi ideology. The presentations include testimony from German doctors who resisted participating in medical murder, demonstrating that choices existed even under totalitarian pressure. The contrast becomes inescapable. American medicine, despite its abundance and technological superiority, maintains ethical standards that preserve human dignity. German medicine, despite its claims of racial and cultural superiority, descended into barbarism that violated fundamental medical principles. The German nurses begin to understand that their captors represent not just technological advancement, but moral advancement that makes their own nation's achievements seem primitive and corrupt. The psychological impact extends beyond professional identity into fundamental questions of national loyalty and moral responsibility. These women, who entered military service believing in German cultural superiority, confront evidence that their nation committed crimes that render all claims of civilization meaningless. Yet from the wreckage of their beliefs, something new will be built, a future shaped by the very enemies they once despised. May 1945. Germany lies in ruins, but in American prisoner of war camps, former enemies prepare for the most important mission of their lives, rebuilding their nation's medical system according to principles learned from their captors rather than their former leaders. The education programs American authorities implement for German medical personnel go far beyond basic repatriation preparation. At the University of Nebraska Medical School Extension Program at Fort Robinson, German nurses study public health methodology, epidemic control, and emergency medicine techniques they will need to address the massive medical crisis awaiting them in occupied Germany. Colonel Richard Stevens addresses the final graduating class. "You're returning to a nation with 60% of its hospitals destroyed, medical schools closed, and a population facing malnutrition, disease, and trauma on an unprecedented scale. But you're not returning empty-handed. You carry knowledge that can rebuild German medicine on foundations of science and human dignity rather than ideology and racial hatred." The curriculum includes water purification techniques, mass vaccination protocols, and malnutrition treatment methods developed from American wartime experience. More importantly, it emphasizes medical ethics that prioritize patient welfare over political considerations, a fundamental rejection of Nazi medical doctrine that subordinated healing to ideological goals. Schwester Hoffmann returns to Hamburg in September 1945, carrying certification in American medical techniques and a worldview fundamentally transformed by her captivity experience. She finds a medical landscape devastated by bombing and depleted by war, but she also finds opportunities to implement everything she learned from her enemies. The nursing school she establishes emphasizes patient advocacy over hierarchical obedience, scientific method over ideological doctrine, and universal care standards that treat all patients with equal dignity, regardless of race, religion, or political background. These principles, learned in American captivity, become the foundation for post-war German medical reconstruction. By 1950, former prisoners of war lead dozens of German nursing schools and hospitals. They introduce American protocols for blood banking, systematic antibiotic use, and patient care standards that transform German medical practice. Their influence extends through thousands of students who carry forward principles learned from former enemies rather than former leaders. The transformation proves lasting and profound. German medicine, rebuilt by women who experienced American abundance and ethical standards during captivity, develops along humanitarian rather than ideological lines. Their story demonstrates that even the most indoctrinated minds can change when confronted with undeniable evidence of superior alternatives. The 9 nurses who emerged from Cherbourg's underground hospital expecting death found instead a future they could never have imagined, one where former enemies became teachers and former certainties gave way to better truths.